And a huge warm welcome to my guest today, Dr. Kim Collett, who I am excited to talk all things inclusion. But first, let me tell you a little more about our guest. Dr. Kim Collett has a PhD in inclusive education and is an associate lecturer teaching on education, research, social work, and social science degrees. Her research focuses on how we understand what inclusion is and how this is experienced by those in the classroom, as well as how research can listen to the voices of those often silenced by research and society. Her passion for inclusive education comes from her own experiences of being a child with special educational needs and how she never felt included at school. This ignited a passion for inclusion as she doesn't want others to feel the way that she did. What a beautiful mission to be on. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Kim Collett today. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you. Thank you for having me, Lucy.
No, at all. Thank you for coming on and talking about something, A, that's so important and prevalent in society at the moment, and B, something that's clearly going to be really real for you as an individual. Thank you for taking the time to come and share this with us. So you shared in that bio that you had your own experience of not feeling included at school, and that's kind of shaped your passion and your drive going forward for inclusion. Are you okay to tell us a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, of course. So I'm neurodiverse with a few different diagnoses under that label. And when I was at school, I always felt that there was something wrong, that there was something different about me. Other children could do things that I couldn't do. I'd put effort in and there would be nothing kind of at the end of it within certain subjects. And that was always quite difficult. And my mum is neurodiverse and she is an awesome champion for me and my brother as well, actually. She's wonderful. And she kept going to school saying, I think it's a neurodiversity thing. But it was still something that we knew a bit about, but we didn't know loads about when I was at school. So at primary school, it was all, no, she's fine. There's no problem there. I remember things like, doing spelling tests in English and getting nothing out of 10. And despite the effort I put in, we used to have a chart on the wall that scored you with stickers, and I used to get like a black sticker against my name, which was, I know. It was, I don't think they do that sort of thing anymore, but it was done as a sort of, this is to almost humiliate you into actually trying a bit harder. So things like that were just awful. When I went to secondary school, my mum, again, kept carrying on this advocacy for me. Brilliant. Mums are brilliant, aren't they? And eventually when I was 14, my parents got me a private ed psych diagnosis to kind of show that, yes, there was stuff that needed to happen and stuff that I needed support with. And that was really good, actually. Knowing that I was neurodiverse meant that I felt that I knew what was going on and could have some ownership and control over that. I could work out how my brain worked and realise that it wasn't broken. It was just, a different way of thinking about things and a different way of working. Now, I went to a grammar school because where I grew up, they still have grammar schools. And their attitude was very much, you can't be clever and neurodiverse. That's like two opposite things, which is crazy. And I'm so glad that we've moved beyond that, not all the way, but we have started to move beyond that perception. So the support I got was a bit lackluster, just a bit sort of tick boxy. So I did well academically because I love learning. And as soon as I got my diagnosis, I worked out how my brain worked. I went from getting a D in English to an A star within 4 months because I could just work it out. It just, all the pieces kind of fit together. And I was like, right, well, I know how my brain works. I can learn like this. But it was very much, I had to teach myself how to do that. And yeah, I did well academically, but I didn't fit in. And, I had lots of kind of negative experiences with people sort of sniggering when I tried to read aloud in class, teachers assuming that I hadn't, tried as hard as I could have done, being left out of stuff. So all of that side of things was quite a negative experience. And that has quite a lasting impact. I've done well. I like the life I've got. And being neurodiverse is part of the reason I've got this life that I like. But it does have a lasting impact when you don't have that sense of belonging or you don't feel accepted by the people around you. So it's just such an important thing. And my own experiences very much have driven the fact that I want to do what I can to try and make the situation better, because the way I felt at school, I wouldn't want anyone to feel like that. So it's sort of become that mission for me, really.
And you do find, don't you, that lived experience is the driver for a lot of passionate missions in life for people. You find when you look at kind of charities and CICs and people that are kind of on a social mission as well, a lot of it is driven because of that lived experience. And I think there's a lot to be said for that ignition of passion and drive behind a cause. Kind of needs that lived experience, I think, because it needs that anger behind it, that frustration, that feeling of, oh, I don't want anyone else to feel the way that I felt because that was awful. And it's terrible to think that we have to go through something like that to be the voice for people going through something like that now. But actually, it's great in the sense that we have that relevance to what people are doing, and we can really say, oh yeah, I've been there, I know what you're going through, and people know that you know that what they're going through because you've been there. So I think that it's really beautiful to hear that that's what's driving what you're doing. And I'm sorry that you went through that in the education system, and sadly we both know that's not an isolated story, and that many people have been through that. And it's interesting when you were saying kind of people were thinking that you weren't trying hard enough. And you know, I do think we've come a long way, and I'm sure we'll talk about this as we go on, and I know you've done a lot of research in this field, but I do think that there is still lots wrong with how we are looking at inclusion within educational settings, and how it's being applied or not. What do you think, what do you wish that your teachers had done back then? Now that you know what you know, now that you've kind of looked into inclusion as a research field, what kind of things do you think that your teachers should have been doing back then?
I think a lot of it back then, so, you know, 25 years ago, was a lack of understanding about it. And I think that was the fundamental root. So I said a minute ago that, you know, I went to a grammar school, so it was very much everyone who comes here gets A's and B's. If you get anything less than that, then, you know, that's a problem. And it was all about success and academic and clever in the very sort of traditional sense of what clever might look like in a school. And there was just a real lack of understanding that actually brains can work in lots of different ways. And that doesn't mean that you're not intelligent and not capable and all of those sorts of things. So I think more understanding about neurodiversity is really the first step. And that would have made a big difference. Because I think what I needed was somebody to turn around and say, yeah, that's fine. You're neurodiverse. We accept that. And we know that that doesn't mean that you're flawed or that there is a problem. And just that acceptance of difference, I think, would have made a huge difference to me from the teachers. And I think if the teachers can demonstrate that, then that has a knock-on effect to the students in the class. I mean, you're always going to get children that sort of pick out difference and stuff, because that is kind of part of how things happen when you are children. But I think if teachers were to have modelled a bit more of acceptance of difference and celebrating difference, then not only would that have made me feel better, but I think it would have also role modelled that to the other sort of children and teenagers when we're in secondary school, in the classroom itself as well. So I think that has a really big impact, definitely.
Yeah. You know, you don't think of it like that, do you? In the sense of how the teachers are behaving, how that would potentially have a knock-on effect to the students in the class, even though we know that modelled behaviour is how children learn. And, you know, people pick up, like, even as adults, we pick up on our surroundings, and that's how we learn things. So, yeah, it makes sense that your teachers are there to demonstrate the correct way to behave and conform in certain situations, I guess. And so if they're not doing that in the classroom, then that's going to have a knock-on effect to the rest of the students, isn't it? So I think,
I think it is important. I mean, it's not going to eradicate everything, because, you know, children will do what children do, don't they? But it does make a big difference. And I know in sort of the lecturing and stuff that I do, I'm usually quite open and honest with the students that I've got about my neurodiversity and all that kind of stuff, because I think it is really important that we have it represented, because I think that goes a long way to being able to show that actually, you know, we are all different, and it doesn't matter whether I'm the teacher or the student, there could still be differences in the way that we learn. And it's important not to sort of hide away from those things, but talk about them to show that actually difference is normal, and that doesn't mean that we can't do all of these things. And we should be accepting of each other and all of that sort of stuff. So I think that kind of role modeling that we've got our own identity as well as the behaviors and the acceptance is really important too.
Yeah, I agree. And I had an experience not too long ago. I went into a school and was helping with like a careers day, and we were doing mock interviews with the year 10s and year 11s and looking at their CV and helping them kind of that transition into the workplace. And during one of my mock interviews, I said to one of the students that I was autistic. And I could sense when she sat down that she felt incredibly anxious and nervous. And I'd been told that she'd come from, she was a student from the SEND unit. So right at the offset, when I introduced myself and explained, and I said, and I'm autistic, and the relief that spread over her, her body language instantly changed. She went, so am I. And then the rest of our conversation, she was so much more relaxed, and she gave me some eye contact, which she hadn't done from when she'd come over and sat at the table. And just me kind of removing that barrier and saying, this is my experience, she instantly, she opened up. She was the chattiness that came from her afterwards, and she wanted to tell me everything, and it just removed that barrier and created that sense of belonging that you were talking about. And that's so important. And so I agree. I think in the classroom, if that's something that you're bringing to the table and you're open and honest about it, you may not necessarily notice, but that might be what some of those students need to go, okay, this is a safe space. I can relax and learn. Incredible. So how did those early experiences kind of lead you towards a career in education and research?
Well, I've always loved learning. So that has been, never gone away. Even with the bad experiences I had, always loved learning. I was one of those weird children that used to set myself my own homework if I didn't have enough, because I just loved doing it, which makes me sound really geeky, but I just love learning. So I kind of, that passion has always been there. So I've collected degrees and stuff because I just sort of feel the need to learn all the time.
I'm there with you. I totally get this.
Exactly. Never stop learning. It's really important. But anyway, I digress. So my own experiences of that, I always kind of knew that I wanted to do something that would make a difference. And my experiences at school meant that when I left school and sort of was thinking about what to do, and after I did kind of my undergraduate degree, I never in a million years thought I would go into teaching, because the thought of being in a classroom, standing up in front of people, talking and all of that kind of stuff felt, like a sort of so nerve-wracking, sort of I would dread that kind of situation. So I went into the voluntary and charity sector instead and did lots of work with different charities around neurodiversity, disability, mental health and that sort of thing. But the more that I carried on studying myself, and the more I did that work, I realised that actually education is so powerful, because if we can get education right, then it has such a ripple effect. And I just think that that is really the core of how we're going to change things for the better. So I looked into it and started doing some more bits and pieces to do with training and teaching, and realised I actually loved it. And that surprised me completely. If you told me that when I was 16 or 18 or even 20, I would have gone, there is no way I am ever going to be any form of teacher. So I went into that and realised I loved it, and kind of felt that I had a bit of a knack for explaining things, for connection and that kind of thing. And I think that is because of my own experiences. So the way that I teach and I tutor is the way that I would have wanted to be taught and tutored, because I just think it's really important that everyone can access education and feel part of that, because it should be open to absolutely everyone. We might learn in different ways and have different abilities and capabilities within it, but we can all learn something in some way. And I just sort of, fell into it a little bit. It wasn't my initial goal, but I'm so glad that I did, because I absolutely love it. I love research, I love education, and I love teaching at a university. I think it's brilliant. And I don't think I would do anything else. I think that's it for me. That's my career. Yeah, it's what I was made to do.
And that's so magical, isn't it, when you find that in life? Because that doesn't always come straight away for people. And, you know, people sometimes don't find their careers until later in life to see them through. So I think it's really magical, that moment when you find it. I've very recently found mine as well, which is I can really resonate with that. And when you were saying, like, if you think back to when you were 16, I would never have been working in education either. I really struggled with school, not from an academic perspective, but from an anxiety and emotional perspective. I think back then, EBSA wasn't a thing, emotional-based school avoidance wasn't a thing, but I think that's what it was. In primary school, I very rarely went. I was that child that we lived like 10 minutes walk from primary school. My mum would walk me to school, and by the time she'd got home, she had a voicemail on the home phone, because no, didn't have mobiles then. I had a voicemail saying, Lucy's in the office, doesn't feel well, you need to come back and get her. And then it got to the point where they stopped calling her, and I'd have to just sit in the office because they were like, Lucy, you're fine. Like, which was worse, because I was like, now I can't go in because they won't send me home. I had a real attachment to my mum, and a real anxiety growing up. So I had separation anxiety. I didn't want to be apart from her. So then when they stopped sending me home, I was like, right, well, I can't go in because they won't, and then I can't come back to my mum. So then I started kind of creating in the mornings, and ill, to the point that I would physically be sick sometimes because I'd worked myself up so much. I remember the conversations with my mum. She would be like, they're going to put me in prison. The truancy officer is calling because I'm not sending you to school, which obviously I was so attached to my mum, and I felt awful, but at the same time I couldn't bring myself. So I had like lots of worries with school. We got over it as she became a parent helper, so she came to school with me. And secondary school was better, and I became very focused on my academia in secondary school. I do have a love of learning. I love learning. It was just the environment I found really hard. I suppose it makes sense now that I know that I'm neurodivergent now, but I didn't get that until last year was when I got my diagnosis, so many years later. But I never ever thought that I would work in education, because education was something that I loved learning, but I didn't like being in that environment. And I really struggled. So similar to what you were saying. So then when I ended up working in schools, and then I did my degrees and then my masters, and then I went into higher education, and now I'm doing my PhD. I'm like, who even am I? Like, this wasn't me.
I know, and you think back to the people you went to school with, and you think, if you asked them if they didn't know you, and you asked them, well, what do you think I would have gone into? And like, none of them would have said education or teaching or anything. It's a real shocker, but it's a wonderful place to be, isn't it? And I think you do get quite a few people that go into it who had bad experiences themselves at school because they want to be the teacher or the educator that they didn't have. And I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, and I've spoken about this before, but that importance of the relationship with, I say good in inverted commas, good teachers. Yeah. I remember in primary school, my year 4 teacher, her name was Mrs. Johnson, and she was my safe space at school. Yeah. She just got me. She had a way that she could speak to me when I was feeling anxious. She didn't pressure me into anything. She had like a really softly spoken voice, like everything. And she was like my absolute favourite teacher. And I remember she left and had a baby, and she called the baby Lucy, and I was like,
oh, lovely.
What a relationship. But that's so important, the relationship between teacher and student, and when it's done properly, it can really be a lifeline and a safe space for a student who's struggling. 100%. And when it's not done properly, it can really be the cause of a lot of stress and anxiety for a student. So I think it's really important to get the relationships right as well in schools. We've gone off on a bit of a tangent there, but it's so important to have that, and it can make all the difference, can't it, for a young person accessing education.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, kind of the research that I've done into sort of current experiences of inclusive education, relationships are one of those things that keep coming up as being such a fundamental part of what makes a child feel included. And if you don't have those relationships, then no matter what all the other stuff is that you do, it's not as effective, because that is like your starting point, those relationships. Not just between teacher and student, but also, you know, with your peers as well, and the other people that are involved in your school. But that teacher-student relationship in particular is so important, because if that's right, like you say, it's a safe space. So the person then feels comfortable being in that classroom. They feel comfortable in asking for help, or saying they don't quite understand, or that they need something, and advocating a bit more for themselves. But also that teacher will know them better. So they will then also hopefully be able to pick up on their needs, and if something's wrong, a little bit better too. And it just has such a big impact, really. It can make a child feel safe. It can make them feel seen, make them feel that they're part of something, that somebody wants to connect with them. And that can look like lots of different things and be different for different children. But I really do believe that relationships are the foundation for anything to do with inclusion. Before we even think about things like specific interventions or teaching strategies, if we haven't got that right, then, you know, the rest of it's not really going to be as effective as we hope it might be.
Yeah, I completely understand that. So before we get too much into inclusion, inclusion can mean lots of different things to lots of different people. Yes. It's one of those words, isn't it? Do you have a definition for inclusion or inclusive education? Is there a definition? How would you define it?
Well, you're completely right. I mean, inclusive education is something that we talk about a lot. So if you're in education, we talk about inclusive education, we talk about inclusion and how important all of that is. But we don't actually have a clear cut, this is what it is. You know, if we look at things like policy and stuff like that, then it's quite ambiguous. Like, you know, all children should have a quality education. We think, well, what does that mean? What does that look like? And some people say that's the problem, is that we don't actually know what it is, and that's why we can't do it, or we're struggling to do it. But actually, I think that despite, you know, I've done so much in inclusive education, I don't think I would be able to define it. I think it is so varied and multifaceted. You know, there's lots of different components for it. And it's different, isn't it, for different people? What might make me feel included might not what make you feel included. You know, we're different people. We'll have different needs, different preferences, different backgrounds, experiences that we're bringing to the situation we're in. So what works for one person might not work for another. And it can be different, can't it, from different days, even different lessons. You know, what might make me feel included in PE might look very different to music or English, and so on. So actually, I think trying to narrow it down into a simple, neat one sentence is actually counterproductive, because it doesn't show that subjectivity and that context that shapes it, and the way that it can change as well. So when I talk about inclusion and inclusive education, I always just sort of talk about how actually it is many different things, and it can look like different things to different people. And I know some people find that a little bit scary, because we would love to have a blueprint, wouldn't we? We'd love to have a list that says, if you do all of these 10 things, then inclusion will be done, and you can pat yourself on the back and every child will feel happy and be brilliant. But in real life, that doesn't work. And I think sometimes when we try and find neat, universal definitions, it kind of makes us almost feel like we can have that checklist or that blueprint. And I think that's a bit of a dangerous sort of game to get into, because that then often oversimplifies things and we can become complacent. It doesn't mean that we can't do things that make people feel included, but I think we just need to be careful that we don't kind of go down this route where we oversimplify it and it ends up being a one-size-fits-all kind of tokenistic thing. So I'm always a little bit vague when anybody asks me to define what it actually is, because I don't think we can. I really don't.
I hadn't considered it from that perspective, and you're so right, because I guess the crux of inclusion is identifying that everyone is different, and how can you best meet the needs of that individual. So that makes perfect sense to not really have that checklist, as you say, to be able to go down. I guess you know, as you've touched upon, it's useful to have an idea of things that you can kind of go through, and are we doing this, are we doing that, you know, are we meeting this kind of need? And I guess there's potentially going to be wider needs that many people are going to need meeting. So in that way, you could essentially meet many needs with one type of intervention or behaviour or action or what have you. But I guess when you get down to the nitty gritty of it, it is going to be really individual for each individual person. So it would need to be looked at in that individual way. So I guess the confidence would come in the person knowing how to look at an individual person and identify the needs through that way, I guess.
Yeah, and that's absolutely, you know, what you're saying about a range of different things that generally make people feel included. Absolutely. There are lots of different strategies and interventions, you know, that make a lot of people feel included, that we can kind of go, right, have we done all of these things? And all of those things can be really useful, and we should be, you know, looking at doing those things. It's when we just stop at that and we don't then look and say, okay, well, we've done all of these kind of standard things, but actually there will be additional things that are needed for some children, and that will be different for different children and at different times. And if we don't do that next step, that's when we become tokenistic. So, you know, despite really good intentions, if we don't follow through with then thinking about those individuals as individuals, then we won't truly kind of get to a point where we can say that we've included everybody. And I think the most important thing really is going back to what we talked about a minute ago with relationships. If you've got a good relationship with your students, no matter how old they are, whatever level of education you're in, if you've got that relationship, then you're much more likely to be able to then connect in with those individuals and be able to talk to them about what they need, maybe involve their parents, or, you know, if you know them really well, some of it you'll be able to sense yourself as well, and you'll be able to then think a bit more and act a bit more on what those individual things might be that those people need. And also spot when it's not working. You know, sometimes we try things and they don't work, and there's no shame in that, because, you know, sometimes we don't know until we actually try something. But if we can be kind of reflective on that and think about, you know, how actually we might need to adapt things, we might need to change things, they might stop working. You know, inclusion is evolving. It's not one static thing. So we need to sort of move with that and kind of adopt that attitude to the fact that we need to adapt, and we will have to reflect on what we're doing and change things and then reflect again, and, you know, that sort of cycle. Yeah,
absolutely. This might be a difficult question. I don't know if there's an answer to this. Can we ever be truly inclusive for everyone?
I think that's a really big question, isn't it?
I should have saved it for the end. It should have been the pinnacle of our conversation.
I think the optimist in me would say, yes, we can. But I think realistically, if we're thinking about true inclusion, where every single person feels included all of the time, I think that's quite idealistic, because you almost can't have inclusion without exclusion. You know, we often pit them one against the other, but it is more of a sort of spectrum kind of thing. They're not necessarily polar opposites. And when I say that, I don't mean that we have to exclude some people for other people to be included. But I think what it kind of demonstrates is that actually inclusion isn't necessarily one kind of place that we can all get to exactly the same time and be there all of the time. It's not like a single destination, so to speak. So I think there will always be times where someone might not feel as included as they do at other times. And there can be a whole host of reasons. It might not be what the school are doing. It might be that something's happened at home and you bring those feelings and experiences from home into your classroom. It might be that one of your friends has said something. They may not have even intended for it to be something that makes you feel isolated or picked on or whatever, but it might come across to you in that way. And I think it would be very difficult for us to eradicate all of those possible situations where somebody might not feel as included as we want them to feel, or they want to feel. And it is really difficult from a practical level as well, isn't it? If you've got 30 children in your classroom and one of them needs to get up and move around, But another one finds it really distracting when someone does that. Someone needs silence, but somebody else can't work in silence and they need music. There are lots of examples where we could go, how actually do we accommodate all of these needs when they can compete with each other and contradict each other? So I think some level of acceptance that it's difficult and that it won't always be perfect is quite helpful. Not so that we kind of are defeated by it, but actually it can help us think a little bit more creatively, a little bit more honestly and openly about what's going on. So I think that's quite important. I think we can be really inclusive. We're definitely not there now, but I think we can be really inclusive. But I think if you wanted to go right for true inclusion, where everyone is fully included all of the time, I think that would be quite a tricky thing for us to try and reach.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think you've made a very good point there. What role do parents play in inclusion in schools, if any?
I think parents and families are a really important part of it. We often think of inclusion in terms of what the teachers are doing and what the schools are doing, but it's a community, isn't it? When we think about education, when we think about a child, there's lots of people involved in that child's life. So I think parents and families can play a really important role in helping with inclusion, for their individual child. So that advocacy and that support and that going to school and saying, my child is struggling with this, can they have this? That can be difficult for a lot of parents, but being their champion, being their advocate is really important. But also being that kind of safe, loving space for them as well, so that your child can feel like they can be themselves and that there's nothing wrong with being themselves. If they are different because of whatever special educational need or disability or any other type of thing that might make them on the margins of what's going on, if you can foster at home that kind of safe, you can be who you are because you're wonderful just as you are, then that hopefully will be something that child can take through into the school environment and have it as a bit of a shield. And I think that can be quite important. And even if your child's not like that, even if your child feels happy and fully included at school, I think there's a lot that parents can do generally just to make sure that, that their children are aware of difference and are accepting of that and are kind. And all of those things are really important, because the attitudes and opinions that parents and families have are going to rub off, aren't they, on the children and what happens at school as well. And just all of those other things that parents can get involved with, again, they can be those role models and things as well, can't they? So yeah, I think it's a fundamental role that they play, definitely.
Yeah, that's so true. And I did some research a couple of years ago looking at the prejudice reporting procedure in early year settings. And it was absolutely fascinating. And we really kind of dug into the impact of because it was at early years level. So these children are like 3, 4, 5 years old in nurseries, and you think, oh, they don't have any prejudices. They don't, discriminate and it's that fine line between, is it a prejudiced behaviour or is it just kind of observation? A 3-year-old saying that girl's got brown skin. Why haven't I got brown skin? Is it a developmental comment or is it coming from a prejudiced background? And so looking at what's happening at the home, and what influence are the children having at home, what are the conversations happening within the setting, how are the staff behaving, how are they approaching topics of conversation around diversity and inclusion and things like that. And that was really interesting to see and to think about the impact of the home and the parents and the educational staff around the students and how that then impacted their behaviour, which is, kind of what we're saying in schools around the parents at home and the teachers and things like that. And it really does have an impact, doesn't it? Even down to that really young age.
Yeah, and I think gender stereotyping is a really good example of that, isn't it? Because even from a very young age, and a lot of the time it's not intentional, but it's like, these are boys' toys, these are girls' toys, this is what a boy does, this is how a girl does, this is what you wear, this is what you wear. And subtle things like that can actually, have quite an impact. And things that we do, on a fairly automatic basis, don't we? We go into the shop and there's an aisle for boys and there's an aisle for girls and things like that, and you can see that then, can't you, from a very early age, that children have this kind of stereotype with things like gender. And that's just one example, isn't it, of many different sort of things that can influence what a child thinks about themselves, thinks about others, and how they behave.
Yeah, and I really like what you said about, even if your child isn't struggling with inclusion, but helping them to become aware of others who might be and what they can do to help. And I think that's kind of forgotten sometimes. I remember speaking to somebody within the SEND community, and they were talking about how important it is to educate neurotypical children about children who might be neurodivergent, and actually how they can embrace and just that understanding, because everything comes from understanding, doesn't it? And goes back to what you were saying about how important education is. Knowledge and understanding is kind of the foundation of behaviours and everything going forward. So we can't expect our young people to be inclusive and to behave in a certain way if they don't understand it, and if they don't acknowledge that there is a difference and this is okay and this is how we can help other people. So I really liked that you touched upon that it's equally as important for us as parents and for teachers to help those children who may not even be struggling to understand how they can better the experience of those around them, and just as a byproduct, it would improve their own experience as well, won't it?
Definitely. And it was one of the things that surprised me a little bit from the research that I did in secondary schools. So some of the students that I talked to, there were lots of different experiences that they shared, which was really insightful. But some of the things that they were saying surprised me a little bit in terms of the amount that they wanted to be inclusive. So I talked to some with special educational needs and disabilities and some without. And across both groups, they were frequently saying, I like to do this to make sure people are included, or I would like school to do this, or I think we should do this. There was a real awareness across all of them that actually there were things that they could do. There were things that their friends could do. There were things that teachers could do, and that they wanted to do that. They wanted to help. And I thought that sort of surprised me a little bit, because I thought going into it that a lot of the answers I would get would be what they thought about themselves and, kind of this is the experience that I have. But there was a lot of thinking around that idea that each and every one of them could be part of making somebody feel included and be part of what the solutions could be. And I thought that was really lovely and really important, actually. So, that was really good.
Yeah. So tell us a bit more about the research that you did. So what were you setting out to do? What did it entail, the research?
So I wanted to have a look at inclusive education, and I particularly focused on secondary schools because that was the place that I felt the least included myself. So I wanted to see kind of what the situation was now, kind of 20, 25 years later, hoping that it would be better. And also because secondary school is a difficult level of education, because we go from primary that it has a lot of pressures and things, but primary in general can be a little bit more inclusive because there's still elements in there of things like play and stuff like that. I think there needs to be loads more, but that's a different conversation. But in secondary school, we become even more focused on subjects and grades and exams. And also you've got teenage identity forming, which plays a part with belonging and all sorts of things. So I focused on inclusive education in secondary schools for my study. And what I did was found out the experiences of those actually in the classroom, because they're the people who are living it. They're the people who are impacted the most by it. So what do they think and feel? So I talked to secondary school students who had a label of special educational needs and disabilities, because that is obviously my background, my speciality. I know that there are so many other groups of children that are also impacted by a lack of inclusion, that's kind of my speciality. So that's what I focused on. And then I also talked to students who didn't have that label. And then I also talked to teachers and teaching assistants in the classroom. So I talked to all of them about what their experiences were. So what made them feel included, or what made them feel that the students were included, and all of the things around that. So, we talked about different types of learning tasks, who was in the classroom, stuff that happened outside of the classroom, all sorts of different things. And then I compared them to see what the similarities and differences are between those groups, because that way we can kind of see if there are any sort of common things that come out of that, then they might be the things for us to focus our limited time and resources on. If there's something that works across everybody, then let's start with that, rather than the things that perhaps could be more contradictory or difficult to implement. So at least we've got some stuff that we can put in place. So that's kind of what I set out to do. I'm really keen that research is inclusive of everybody and can hear those voices of people that often can't or don't take part in research. So, that was really important for me as well. So making sure that it was accessible. And then kind of sort of what it found was actually that inclusive education is so many different things. So, the participants talked about it in lots of different ways. They talk about academic, about social, about well-being, about where they were, all sorts of different things. So what it actually showed was that inclusion was plural. It was multifaceted, like I said, right at the very beginning of our chat. And that's really useful because it just gets us to think differently about what inclusion in the classroom looks like. And if we can look at it in terms of the lived experiences of who's in the classroom, then I think that gives us a really good way of then thinking about actually what is it that we're doing, and can we use those lived experiences to help shape that, so that those that are actually experiencing it are the ones that are kind of in control of what's going on, so to speak, and they're the ones that are having the influence and the impact from what we're doing. So it's really important to hear their voices, definitely.
Can inclusion be measured, or is it something that is purely from a lived experience? Is there kind of a measure that can be used for it?
I think it would be very difficult for us to have one measure of inclusive education because of the variability and the subjectivity. I mean, I think sort of things like numerical measures can still be really useful, because they could kind of show us maybe the trends that are going on, whether, there's an increase in achievement or attendance might tell us that something's working. We might look at progress and go, okay, since we put this intervention in place, this particular child's progress has increased. So maybe that shows us that it works. But I think it would be quite concerning to me if that was the only thing that we were doing, because actually that only tells us a real snapshot, doesn't it? If we don't also have those lived experiences, we don't know the whys behind that. We don't know, why that intervention might have worked for that child, and whether it was just that intervention or coincidence that was what did it. We don't know why attendance has necessarily increased, and whether that is because policy has made it so that parents have to bring their children in even when they don't want to, but when the child's there, they still don't feel included. They might be there physically, but it might not be inclusion. So, a numerical number wouldn't tell us that. It would just tell us that these children are now coming to school, so that we might then say, well, we're doing all right because they're now here. But they might hate the fact that they're there. So, it's very limiting. So we definitely need to have those lived experiences. We need to ask the children what they feel and their opinions and views on that. What are their experiences and their stories about it? Because we won't know the full picture if we don't have that. And the same with teachers and teaching assistants and anybody else involved in the school. It's important to be able to listen to all of their experiences and get all of their feedback, for us to truly understand whether what we're doing is working or not, and why.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a qualitative researcher myself, this makes me smile because it's so important. Like, numbers are important, but lived experience, voices, people's opinions, and it's so important, because it just gives that framing around the numbers. I think it's the numbers give us the what, and the words give us the why, behind it, and that's so important to get a clearer picture of what's going to work going forward. So yeah, I completely agree. Were there any outcomes or interventions that came out as part of your research that were implemented? How did it kind of, in terms of outputs?
So a lot of the sort of things that came out of my research, they ended up being a lot more theoretical than I wanted. I wanted lots of practical, helpful things, but it became much more theoretical, which is fine because research goes off, doesn't it, and does its own thing, and it's never quite what you expect it to be at the start. But there were quite a few things in there that students said they found really useful, and teachers said that they felt was really useful. And that was really good because although it didn't like give a checklist of this is what you need to do to be inclusive that I could then pass on and say this is what you need to do, it did talk a lot about the sorts of interventions that worked, which I think was really quite useful. It's just also really important to remember it's a snapshot. So, you know, I only talked to a certain number of students and teachers. You know, I talked to them just after we got over all the lockdowns and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, the context, the situation that they were in was unique to them at that particular time. So it's quite difficult to say, you know, these are going to be applicable to absolutely everybody. But I think one of the things that actually potentially is the biggest practical outcome of my research is the actual process of listening to each other's voices. So I interviewed people individually, and I used a method called photo elicitation, which is where you have photographs and you look at the photographs and you talk about them as the catalyst to your conversation. Right. So what I did for my second interviews was they chose one of the selection of photos that we had and they wrote a caption to explain why they thought it showed inclusion. I then shared all of those captions and choices with everybody individually, but they could see everybody's. And that was mainly so that I could get more information and kind of talk through differences and similarities. But what it did was it allowed people to see the experiences and views of other people that are also in the classroom. And it actually, this wasn't my intention at all, but it was actually really quite powerful in terms of people understanding it from different perspectives. So you got quite a lot of comments where, you know, if somebody had picked something that was similar to what you picked and your reason for picking that photo of inclusion, then some of the young people were like, that makes me feel really good because it makes me feel that I'm not on my own, that somebody else is thinking and feeling the same thing. So that was really lovely. But also, you know, when some of the teachers read what the children had written, they were like, okay, I didn't realize that was how they felt, but now I do. I can change what I'm doing. I can take that into consideration. Like a lot of the young people put emotions in their captions, like when I'm happy, I feel, or this is inclusion because it's enjoyable. You know, they talked a lot about emotions. And a couple of the teachers were like, I didn't realize that that was so important to them. You know, they said, I understood that they needed to feel safe and welcomed and stuff, but I didn't know that they put so much emphasis on it. And now I do. I can weave that in a bit more. So I think that power of being able to actually stop and think about and hear those voices and experiences of others was potentially an outcome that I hadn't sort of planned for. That wasn't my intention, but I think it was quite powerful because I think it will allow better understanding, and choices that are made in that classroom can reflect that.
So I love the excitement in research when you uncover something you hadn't planned, and it's so happy. It's really, really exciting. And I love that, you know, we can talk about being inclusive in research and making sure that we're talking to a range of different people and hearing everybody's voices and that, but using that technique of the photos as well is just another step of being inclusive in my opinion. And it's, you know, sometimes if you ask a question face to face to an individual, they may struggle to understand what you're asking them. They may struggle to formulate a response to it. It might not be the best way to obtain the voice from that individual. So giving the option of looking at a photo is just another layer of accessing someone's opinion and voice, and gives them a platform to think in a different way that might work better for them. And I think that's really important, especially when it comes to research. And we do talk about being inclusive and hearing the voices that are often silenced, and that's something that a lot of people talk about in research. But then you look at the methods that they've used to collect the research, and it doesn't necessarily match up with being completely inclusive. So I love that you've included the photos. I'd not not really experienced that before, using photographs and kind of trying to elicit responses in that way. Was this new to you for this project, or had you used it before?
No, I hadn't used it before. It was new. I absolutely love it because, especially working with teenagers, if you think about, actually, photography is quite a big part of their lives. If you think about, sharing photos with their friends, how many photos they've got on their phone, social media, all sorts of things. We live in quite a visual world. And actually, so photographs are something that feels quite familiar and quite comfortable for a lot of people. Not everybody, but they are quite a familiar medium. And it just works really well as taking the focus off this kind of dynamic of, right, I'm this adult researcher who you don't know, and I've come in and I want to grill you about your experiences of inclusive education. That is quite scary, isn't it? And being bombarded with questions that you might not quite understand what I'm meaning, and having to then articulate it back is quite a scary and difficult thing, especially if you're working with people that might process language differently, communicate differently. So actually those photographs just give you something you can chat about, and it becomes much more of a relaxed conversation, that it just takes the pressure off, as well as adding that creative element too. And something else that I did as well is, a couple of the participants I had didn't want to talk to me by themselves because of social anxieties and the way that they communicate and the unfamiliarity of that. So they had somebody with them during the interview, like an advocate. And that is something that's not often used in research, because we worry about voice, don't we? Especially when we do qualitative research. It's really important in that it is the true, authentic voice of that person you're interviewing. So if you've got someone else that might be chipping in with answers or rephrasing things, your immediate thing is that changing that person's voice? Is that really what that person means? Has that person changed what they wanted to say because they've got someone sat next to them and they don't want that person to know the real truth of what they're experiencing? So that was new, and I only did that because it was requested by a couple of participants. But actually it worked really well, because it allowed those participants to feel comfortable enough to take part in research, and they wouldn't have taken part in it if they hadn't had that other person with them. There's loads more we need to learn about that, and probably way more than we can talk about now, because it's a massive meaty subject. But I think there are lots of ways that we can adapt research to make it accessible and to make it inclusive. And we're only just scratching the surface of all the possibilities that we could explore with doing that.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I think, currently, as it stands at the moment, with things like that, as long as it's acknowledged, as long as it's kind of highlighted that this may have an impact on the results and things like that, I'm all for transparency and being clear and open and honest with everything. So you can't always do everything that's needed within the confines of a research study for a multitude of different reasons, whether that's time frame, funding, availability to resource, or what have you. So for me, as long as I see in research that somebody has acknowledged a limitation or something that may affect how something has been perceived, then it's still valuable. It's still worth kind of looking at and including it going forward. It's just something that needs to be considered, and that's really hard. So with a lot of the work I do with ReCap, trying to get research in front of parents and families in a really accessible way, and that's something that I'm really trying to work in and help people who don't work in research, who don't have it as their career or qualification or anything like that, is to understand these little nuances that could affect what you're looking at and what you're reading. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true what you're reading, or that it's something that you need to discard, but you have to be aware of it. You have to be aware that this may impact it. So you just need to have it in the back of your mind and, look for more evidence or look for more information around that subject to give you a clearer picture and idea. So I really like that you've spoken about that within your study, and that you've been really open and transparent and explained how that might impact, but why it was still important to do it to enable another element of your research, so the inclusion of that individual on there. So I think that's really important, and something that every researcher should be doing. I don't think everyone does, but I think it's something that is really important in research. So thank you for sharing that. Are there any kind of common misconceptions that you've come across around inclusion that you've heard?
I think there are loads. There are less than there used to be. We are getting better, but I think there are still lots. So I think it's things like people assuming it's just about special educational needs and disabilities. Yep. So I know that is what I focus on because that's my passion, my experience. But there are so many reasons that somebody might not feel included. So I think there's sometimes still that misconception that it's all about special educational needs and having a diagnosed condition and not being able to meet the academic requirements of school, when actually it's much more than that. So I think that's one of the misconceptions that still is hanging on. And one of the other ones is about actually inclusion isn't just about being in a classroom. So, we have that kind of idea that actually if somebody's included, then they'll be in the mainstream classroom. And that whole idea that the mainstream classroom is our end goal and that if you're there, then that's the best thing possible, but it's not. Actually, just physically being somewhere doesn't mean that you feel included. You could be surrounded by people and still feel totally alone and marginalised. So I think we still have that a little bit as a misconception that our end goal should be everybody in the same classroom, and also that misconception that being physically somewhere is the same as being included. So that whole sort of placement scenario is still a misconception, definitely. I mean, there are loads that I could list, but I think those are two big ones that have been hanging on since we really first started thinking about inclusive education decades ago, but they still have a legacy that I think does have an impact, definitely.
Yeah. For any teachers listening, is there one thing that they can do, one change that they can make, or one thing that they can implement tomorrow that would really help go towards being more inclusive in the classroom?
So I think there are loads of things that could be done without too much effort and cost, and that would make a difference. But I think before you even start thinking about teaching strategies or resources or anything, that it harks back to what we talked about a couple of times already, is those relationships. So, the students that I talked to for my research said small things like, when you walk in the corridor, if a teacher says, "Hi, Kim," then you feel like they know who you are, especially at secondary school, because they teach so many students.
Yes.
So things like using your name so that you know that they know you make quite a difference to some of them. And also things like asking them how they are, asking them how their weekend was, or asking them how their hobby is going, and remembering those sorts of things made quite a difference to the students that I talked to. They liked the fact that their teachers knew who they were and remembered stuff that was important to them. Even if it was just a 2-second, "Oh, how's football practice going?" Stuff that made them feel valued because their teacher took the time and care to remember who they were and remember something that was important to them and connected with that. So I think that would be my absolute first step with anything to do with trying to be more inclusive. And I know a lot of teachers do a lot of that already, and that is brilliant. But I also know when we're busy and stressed and we've got so many things to do, that sometimes those things can drop off, and it can be difficult to remember who likes football and who likes knitting and all of those kind of stuff. But I think just those few seconds of connection on an individual basis can really make quite a difference.
Yeah, and I think that translates into any context, doesn't it? In the workplace, that's still the same. It makes the difference when you feel like somebody actually isn't doing it as an autopilot. "Hi, how are you? Hi, how are you? Are you good today?" But knowing you as a person, I think, I can see how that would make a really powerful difference. What message of advice would you give to any student who may have an additional need or maybe not feeling quite included at the moment? Do you have any advice that you could give to them?
I think it's really difficult because when you're in that situation, it can feel so hard. I think that it's not advice, I suppose, as much as just sort of saying that there are those of us that get that, we've been there, and we know it's really hard.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that you're not wonderful and that you're not brilliant at all sorts of different things. You might be in a system that just doesn't work for the way that you need, and that's not your fault, that's the system's fault. And actually you are valued and you have such amazing potential. Just to remember that, really, is to remember that you're not broken, there's nothing wrong with you, and you are incredible just as you are. And I think sometimes it's really hard to remember that when you're feeling that you don't belong and that people aren't accepting you. It can be really tough, but I think if you can try and hold on to that belief that you are special for good reasons and that you have potential to be anything you want to be, I think that can help see you through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I know the answer to this next question, but we've spoken about what teachers can do. We've given advice and support to our young people. What should parents and families be doing? What's their role in inclusion here?
Again, it's the same thing, isn't it? It's, your child is wonderful, that all children are wonderful, no matter who they are, what they've gone through, what label they have, they're all wonderful. And I think celebrating that and making sure that they know that they're wonderful is just, if you do nothing else, I think making sure that your child feels that they are loved and that they're wonderful just as they are, that they're not broken, that no matter what experiences they have at school or whatever it might be, they are them, and that's not a bad thing at all, even if it feels like it is sometimes to them. So it's all about that, isn't it? That love, that nurturing, that support, and it's just so fundamental, and it really does make a difference.
Absolutely. And I think as parents, we find it hard, don't we, when we see our young people struggling, and that's really hard emotionally for us as parents to deal with. And I think sometimes we can get wrapped up in thinking that we're not doing enough when we're kind of just being at home with them, just sitting in the moment with them. I say just in inverted commas.
Yeah.
But actually that makes a huge difference to a young person who's struggling, to know that they've got that support, they've got that safe space, and they've got that advocate. You were speaking, we've spoken a number of times today about our parents being advocates and us being advocates. It's so important to know that someone's got your back and someone is fighting that fight for you and with you, because you can't always fight it by yourself, especially our younger children. So yeah, I think it's really important, and I'm glad that you've reiterated the importance of that relationship between parent, carer or whoever, and child, and being the advocate for them, because it does make all the difference. Even though you can feel like sometimes you are banging your head against a brick wall and not getting anywhere, and that's indicative of it's not the right space, it's not the right place. What are the other options? And I guess that kind of leads into my interest in home and alternative education, because sometimes that mainstream option isn't right for a young person, regardless of what inclusion looks like for that setting. So sometimes we do have to think a little bit outside the box, and are there other ways that this young person can access education and be included at the same time? So I think it all intertwines, doesn't it?
It does, doesn't it? And, if you're in a school where you don't feel included, there is so much effort and energy and emotional drain that has, that when they come home from that, they're going to be exhausted, tired, upset, all of those sorts of things. So being that safe, relaxed space where they can be themselves is so important. And, I like what you say there, that often we think of inclusion as mainstream being the best provision, and anything other than that is sort of seen as lesser quality, or the option we shouldn't go to unless we absolutely have no alternatives. But actually mainstream isn't suitable for all children, no matter what interventions and stuff we do. And if they're going to be happier and better supported and be able to reach their potentials and stuff outside of that normal classroom setting, then we shouldn't demonize that, because it's not the place for everybody.
Amen.
Yes, absolutely.
So if people want to hear more about your work or follow your work as you go forward, connect and say hello, how can people reach out to you and find your stuff online?
So I've got various different bits of research and stuff that are available that you'll find if you sort of Google my name on the library and stuff like that. But I'm also on social media. So if you want to, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on places like Instagram. I will hopefully be launching some stuff on YouTube soon because, like you, Lucy, I think it's so important that we start to kind of, bring all of this stuff out in the open rather than it being hidden away in these academic papers and stuff that we read and lectures that we talk in. So yes, do watch out for that as well. But I'd love to connect because it's such an important topic, and the experiences and stories of people that are involved in it, no matter what role they have within it, really does help inform our understanding and our knowledge further, and what we can do to make the situation better.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth saying that your research is on the Recap website as well. We've simplified it, haven't we? So that's now up. So if you want to look at a simplified version of your research, then it's up on the Recap website as well. And I'm sure this isn't going to be the last that we hear from you, because I'm really keen to keep the conversation going and hear more about your research. So that's fantastic. And I love that you're doing more on social media as well, and supporting that cause of getting research out there. Easy, accessible ways. Love it. I think you're on TikTok as well, aren't you?
Yes, I'm not so good at TikTok. I think I'm learning. I love learning, so I'll get there.
TikTok's a different beast, isn't it? But I think it's important to get it all out there. And what I'll do is I'll put links to everything underneath the episode so people can just easily find you and come through and say hi and get involved in that way. So I want to leave you with the final word. So is there anything that you would like to leave listeners with today? Something that they can take away from it, or an empowering message, or what would you like people to leave today with?
I'm not going to lie. I think inclusion is incredibly difficult, but there are so many incredible examples of inclusive practices going on every single day that it is possible to have that inclusive environment. You can't shy away from the complexity, but it is possible for us to make a difference. And actually, if we can make a child feel included, then we can help that child thrive. And if a child can thrive and flourish as themselves, then it doesn't just impact them, it has a knock-on effect to everybody. So it is well worth the difficulties that we face, because actually the impact can be so significant that I think it is something that we just need to give our all, and it will make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Kim, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your research today, and for fighting the fight to make our young people's lives more enjoyable for everybody. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.